the other in Jewish text and tradition. Special welcome to any first-time attendees who are here for the pre-Shavuot session this week. If you'd like to view recordings of past sessions, you can do so using the link in the email that you received earlier today. So as I mentioned, I mentioned this a few months ago, but the theme of the other in Jewish text and tradition, it touches on so many different aspects of our religious lives, including the holiday cycle. So we were really pleased to be able to have a pre-Purim session and a pre-Pesach session and now a pre-Shavuot session that all access this theme in a variety of ways through the texts of each holiday. So we're so pleased that Dr. Amy Kalmanofsky, who is Dean of Liss College and the Kekst Graduate School, and Blanche and Romie Shapiro, Professor of Bible at JTS, is here to teach us on this theme of the other and identity and inclusion, looking at the book of Ruth as a model. Just a couple of quick announcements before she begins. So if you are feeling inspired by the opportunity to learn with JTS's outstanding scholars, we invite you to consider partnering with us by sponsoring a learning session. We have 2 levels for that, and we will be putting information in the chat. You can always contact learninglives@jtsa.edu to learn more about that. And I just wanted to tell if anyone was not here last week, we're so excited about our summer series. We have such wonderful momentum with this with these Monday webinars, and we love to see you every week, and we're excited to continue. So we have a wonderful summer series planned. We'll put it in the chat as well, but it's called A Wandering People, Jewish Journeys, Real and Imagined. We're going to start on June 7th. And I'll put the description in the chat. We're just working on getting it up on the website and setting up registration for you, but I'm really looking forward to this series. And, you know, part of our thinking is even as we're getting vaccinated and things are starting to open up, we're not doing necessarily the same kind of travel that we might have done over the summers in the past. So maybe we can get some vicarious exploration of the world over this summer through this summer series. Just a word about the Q&A, Tani Schwartz-Herman will be running the Q&A today. So Professor Kalmanofsky will stop periodically throughout the class, also for questions, and we'll also have questions at the end. To submit a question for her, you can use the chat feature and send your question to Tani Schwartz-Herman. And when we pause for Q&A, she will select from those questions to pose to Professor Kalmanofsky. And if you have technical or logistical issues, you can initiate a chat with Lynn Feynman, who I think is listed as JTS staff as well. So the sources were in the email that you received earlier today with the Zoom link, but the source is the book of Ruth. So if for any reason you don't have that link, you can pull a Bible off your shelf. And let me just introduce Dr. Kalmanofsky again, in addition to her title, which I shared with you. Just a little more about her. She teaches courses on biblical literature, religion, and feminist interpretation of the Bible. In her writing and teaching, she combines contemporary ideas and critical methods with traditional text study, helping students to understand and appreciate the Bible's complicated beauty and meaning so that they can become careful and creative interpreters of its text. And we're looking forward to hearing her take on the book of Ruth and having her guide us in the study of the other through her unique approach to text. Professor Kalmanofsky, I turn it over to you.
Excellent. All right. I'm used to unmuting myself, and there it was. Anyway, it's wonderful to see so many of you on what, at least in New York, is a gray Monday, but my guess is where some of you are, it's not as gray as where we are here. So it's wonderful to bring the light of Torah into all of our lives. And it's wonderful to see so many of you Some of you I have that are friends of mine and that I have learned with before. And, you know, having done a number of these things, it's always nice to see, even in this kind of crazy remote world, familiar faces. So, and I'm very grateful for those of you that I recognize. It makes me feel like I'm teaching you all in person. And Dorothy Denberg, this is for you. It's like when I have somebody that I recognize in the screen, it helps me, you know, focus my teaching. Anyway, as Rabbi Endelman said, we are going to do some preparation for the holiday of Shavuot. And it just so happens that the book that we're going to be studying together really fits very much the themes that this series has been focusing upon. So we're going to be thinking about preparing for the holiday of Shavuot, which is a holiday, just as a refresher, that celebrates revelation at Mount Sinai. One could argue, I certainly would argue, that revelation at Sinai is the most formative, right, event of Israel's formation, and this is the holiday that celebrates that. This is also the holiday that celebrates the Spring Harvest Festival. It's very connected to the agricultural calendar. And this is the holiday upon which that we read the book of Ruth, which actually brings all the themes together. It is both about, I would say, revelation and the community and what it means to be part of the community of Israel, as well as it is also a book that is very much tied into the agricultural cycle and celebrates the harvest festival. And as I said a moment ago, it's also a book that very much touches on the themes that this series has been focusing on, the theme of welcoming the other into our communities. So for those of you who have learned with me before, I like to begin with my conclusions, and then I can just say Shabbat Shalom and leave, because we may run out of time. I will do my best to leave some time, maybe in the course of the teaching, to answer some questions. I'll try to do that. I don't always succeed at doing that. But as many of you know who have learned with me before, I'm always happy to continue the conversation going forward informally. So you should feel free to reach out to me. So here are the conclusions I want us all to come to, or the assertions that I'm going to make about this book. Number one, and this to me is in some ways the most important, Ruth is a literarily beautiful, it really is a beautiful book. It is also theologically powerful, and it holds a very, very deep truth that I think is very relevant for all of us today. So I'm just going to say that statement again, because if I say nothing else, I want you to hear this. Ruth is literarily beautiful. It's theologically powerful as a book, and it holds a deep truth that is relevant to all of us today. Number two assertion or conclusion. Despite the title of my talk, which is, I think, as I can read here, model for welcoming the other, I'm actually going to argue that Ruth is not about welcoming the other. It's actually not a book about tolerance, right? And I'm going to be splitting hairs a little bit, but you can hear the difference. In my view, it's a book about how an other, someone as other can possibly be, how an other becomes an us, right? Which I'm saying is very different than tolerance, okay? And very different than welcoming. It's how an other becomes an us, okay? Number three conclusion or assumption is Ruth is about the power of relationships and loyalty, and about how biology, and this is very important to understanding otherness, how biology does not determine family and identity, okay? Ruth is about the power of relationships and loyalty, and how biology does not determine family and identity. You can already hear how relevant it is to conversations that we're having now today in so many of our communities. So for all these reasons, right, I want to say that Ruth is an essential book. I want to say that Ruth's story in many ways is Israel's story. It's often, and I'm going to tell you why in a second, Ruth is often considered to be in some ways an outlier in the Torah. I want to say it's actually not an outlier. It's incredibly essential. I want to argue that Ruth's story, even in the context of the Torah, is Israel's story, and it remains so today. In some ways, it's even more essential today than it was in its ancient contexts. So those are sort of the conclusions that I want us to all get to. And now I want to sort of, still in the context of sort of general introductions into this book, having said how important it is, and actually having said that Ruth is not an outlier, even though it's usually seen as one in the context of the Torah, I also want to admit that in the context of the Torah, Ruth is in some ways a very strange book. It is a strange book that is kind of wrapped in conventional paper, if you will, right? It's a strange book, but it sort of has a conventional feel to it as well. So when you think about what's conventional about this book, what makes this book not feel strange is really that in many ways, it's a book or a story that feels very comfortable within, let's just say, the book of Genesis, or falls very comfortably within the ancestor stories that we find elsewhere in the Torah. On a very basic level, if you wanted to say what the book of Ruth is about, which is, on a basic but not sophisticated level, and I'm going to argue today for a much more sophisticated reading, right? The book of Ruth is about absorbing and embracing otherness, but on a much more sort of surface level, conventional level, if you want to say what the book of Ruth is about, it's about having a baby, right? It's about the efforts that an individual goes to in order to have a baby that is going to be an heir for the family. This is a story that we meet throughout the Tanakh, right? But most significantly within the book of Breshit, within the ancestor stories. Right? So the story of Ruth seems very much, it could be similar to the story of Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah. So that's the convention of it. But when you get past that surface level, everything about Ruth feels actually unconventional. The way this baby is born is unlike the ways that any other baby is born, with maybe one exception we'll talk about, in the context of the Tanakh, right? The way this child is born, right, and we'll unpack this a little bit but to give you some basic knowledge, is that the efforts that are taken to have this baby born sort of fall into the context of the custom of Levirate marriage, right? So just to sort of give you some background, what is Levirate marriage? Levirate marriage is a form of marriage that took place in the ancient world, where if you had a man who is married but doesn't have children, and that man dies without having children, then his widow, right, his female widow, then marries his brother, and the child of the union, right, sort of bears the name of the dead husband. Right? So that's just sort of a context for understanding what's sort of shaping the book of Ruth at large. The way that this child is born, the way that this heir comes to be, is going to come through this context of Levirate marriage. And that makes it very unique and different from the rest of the ancestor stories, right? So that's kind of, I would say, the most thing that makes it sort of unusual in the biblical context. But there are other features of the book of Ruth that make it unusual, if not even a bit strange. One of the things I like to, often say to my students, I often ask them sort of what would be the strangest book in the Torah? What's the strangest story in the Torah? And there are actually many contenders, but I think Ruth is certainly, an argument can be made for it being among the strangest books of the Torah. And it is so, I would say, for these three reasons. The first reason is that God is not an active character in the book of Ruth, right? God is not a character that intervenes and directs the action in the story. That's incredibly significant, right? I would actually say, just even to sort of say more about that, I mean, it is interesting. God is mentioned in the book of Ruth, which is not true about these other books that I'm going to say in a moment. But God is not an active character in the book of Ruth. The book of Ruth is probably, of all the books in the Torah, the most human-centric. Here's a little fun fact, because you should walk away with some fun facts, is there is more dialogue in the book of Ruth proportionally than in any other book in the Torah, right? You have people speaking to other people. So the focus is more on human beings and the interpersonal relationship between human beings and not on God. Number two, the central relationship in the book of Ruth is between two women, right? And that itself makes it unbelievably interesting and unique, if not a little bit strange. Okay. One of the things, I mean, it's true. I just said a moment ago, the book of Ruth is, the most interpersonal in its focus, the most human centric of all the books in the Torah. Right. But the Torah itself is not really that interested in interpersonal relationships. Right. It really isn't. I mean, it's mostly interested in how individuals or how a community relates to God. It's not really interested in how human beings relate to other human beings. That's not its focus. But here in the book of Ruth, we have that focus, and it's also between two women. And the men, with one exception, are sort of ancillary to the story. And that's actually quite interesting. The exceptional man is actually Boaz, which is, he's a significant player in this book, and he raises certain questions that I think have to be addressed, right? But most of the men are sort of taking a back seat to the two central women, which are Naomi and Ruth. Okay, another thing that's just also really interesting about this, if you put point 1 and point 2 together, the fact that God is not an active character and that women are the centerpiece of the story. There are two other books in the Torah in which God is also not an active character. I say we have the book of Ruth, and the other two books in the Torah that I would put in the same category, Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs, and the book of Esther. What do all those three books have in common? Just think about it for a second. I would say all three of them actually are focused on or have strong female voices. By the way, Shir HaShirim, I'm happy to talk about this in a different context, but Shir HaShirim is actually all dialogue, one could say, right? And it is but it's a male and female voice, but the female voice is actually the louder, stronger voice in Song of Songs. So you have three books that don't mention or don't have God as an active character. All three of those books feature women. That's just interesting. As somebody who spends her career thinking about women in the Torah and how they function, it is interesting to me that when you have women elevated, you have God sort of absent. So just think about that. And the final thing that is also really quite unique, and it's connected, right, to the fact that you have these two females at the center of this narrative. And probably the most interesting thing about the book of Ruth is the character of Ruth, and that she is featured, one could say the star of the show, and she is a Moabite woman. Okay, so in the category of other, in the context of the Torah, you can't get more other than that. Right? You cannot get more other than a Moabite woman. So the fact that this story has at its center and its heart, this Moabite woman is extraordinary. And she is as other as one can be. So I want to just say something about the Moabites, because they are, in the context of the Torah, sort of a negative presence. And we have three sort of distinct, two stories and some laws related to the Moabites. So what do we know about the Moabites? Number one, we have an etiological story about them, right? Which is, we sort of know the ancestor, where did they come from? The story that tells how the Moabites came to being. And that story is actually told in the book of Genesis, in the book of Bereshit, in Genesis chapter 19. And it is connected to the destruction of Sodom and Amorah, Sodom and Gomorrah. And the cities are destroyed. And of course, Lot, who is Abraham's nephew, is saved from the city. He runs away from the city. He runs only with his 2 daughters. They head into a cave. They think the world is completely gone. And what happens? The daughters seduce their father and have his children. One of them has the ancestor to the Ammonites, and the other has the ancestor to the Moabites. So it's a wacky story. You should definitely look at it. But the point is that the Moabites came to being through incest. In the context of the Torah, not a good thing. The next story that we have with the Moabites, which is also in some ways you could say the worst story, if where it's actually judgment is made. One of the horrific moments in Israel's history as it's wandering around the desert has to do with Moabite women. So Moabite women, we read this, it's in Numbers 25, Moabite women seduce the Israelites, one assumes sexually, but then also takes them into idol worship, creates a whole bloodbath and a horrible, horrible thing. So it's the Moabite women that are in fact condemned for seducing the Israelites, and that takes place in Numbers chapter 25. And because of that and a few other things, we actually have, and this is incredibly significant for the story that takes place in the book of Ruth, you have in Deuteronomy chapter 23, verses 4 to 5, you have the prohibition that says that Israelites cannot marry Moabites ever. You cannot welcome them into the community of Israel ever. I want you to hear that, and I want you to appreciate that, because that's not what we have in the book of Ruth, correct? And one has to say there's an intentionality there. And just to show you, or to suggest how interesting that is, you cannot marry the Moabites, but guess what? You can marry the Edomites, which are, sort of attributed to Esau, not a good figure in the context of the Torah. And you can marry Egyptians after the 3rd generation. So you can welcome Egyptians into the community. You can welcome Edomites into the community, but you can never, ever welcome a Moabite into the community of Israel. And now we have the book of Ruth, right? So to me, the most remarkable thing is that this book features these 2 women, the relationship between these 2 women, one of whom is a Moabite. And you should ask yourselves, what's going on here and why? So the relationship between Ruth and Naomi, in my mind, right? I'm obviously arguing for that it's an incredibly significant. I think it is an incredibly interesting relationship. It is utterly defined by otherness, right? Not only, and this is to me just so fascinating, not only because she's a Moabite, Ruth, so you have this Israelite and this Moabite woman in this deep connection with each other. So that's certainly true, but this is an in-lawed relationship. They are not blood relatives. So this is a relationship that forms between Ruth and Naomi that is completely defined by otherness. And where this relationship ultimately is going to take Israel, right? If you want to say, again, what this story is really about, is it is about the birth of a baby. It is about the birth of a designated heir. And of course, the baby that is born is going to be the ancestor of King David. So this relationship, this should just be so, to me, obviously you can see it's very fascinating for me, right? But this relationship that is so defined by otherness, by being a Moabite and an Israelite, by not having any blood connection, gives birth to or introduces in, one could argue, the most significant bloodline in Israel's history. So this other this other relationship gives rise to this incredibly significant bloodline. So what I want to do now is focus on this relationship and talk about the nature of this relationship, which is a relationship that what I love about it, and you're going to see this too, that really does evolve in the course of the book. So I'm going to ask you here are the questions I want you to think about as we go through the texts. So the first question I want us to think is, what is the nature of the relationship between Ruth and Naomi? And by this, I want you to think categorically. Those of you who have learned with me before, I like to think in terms of categories. They can be dangerous because you shouldn't put things in neat little boxes. You should always be suspicious, but they're helpful to me in sort of unpacking a particular text, right? So when I think about the nature of this relationship, I'm asking you to think about what kind of relationship is it, right? Is it a relationship that's like a family relationship, a relationship that you will have with somebody in your family? Or is it a relationship that you have between friends? Right? Is it a friendship? And if it's a family relationship, what kind of relationship is it? Right? Is it like just to give you some possibilities, a mother-daughter relationship? Is it like a sister-sister relationship? Is it like a husband and wife relationship? So when you think about what kind of relationship, that's what I want us to think about. And one thing and this is really what I'm going to argue for, is this relationship shifts. The way it begins at the beginning is not the way that it ends up, right? So the nature of the relationship really shifts. Second question to think about is who holds the power in the relationship. Every relationship, and everybody on this call can attest to it, has a power dynamic. And sometimes those power dynamics are in the DNA of the relationship, but more often than not, they are constantly shifting. So it is just an interesting thing. I always say to students, the two questions you should always ask when you want to unpack any kind of dynamic, and some of you have heard this from me before, is when you approach a text, who looks good and who looks powerful? A biblical text. And that's an interesting way to kind of get the dynamic, sort of lift up the dynamic. So to me, this question of who's got the power in the relationship, Ruth or Naomi, is interesting, and to see how that power dynamic shifts. How does this relationship evolve? And that's something that we're really going to look at. And then finally, I hope we will have some time to answer the question, what can we learn from this relationship? Because as I said, I feel that this book is essential in the context of the Torah, and I think it is profound for us today. So to me, what can we learn from this nature of this relationship? So what I wanted to do is look at a few passages. You should have the whole book. It's only 4 chapters. It is a magnificent book, but we will be looking mostly at the first chapter, which I want to say is a true inflection point in the narrative. And then we're going to look at a piece of the second chapter and head to the end. But all of these questions you can really keep live when you go through the book and when you read the book over Shavuot. Hopefully you will have them in mind. So I have in front of me a copy of, I don't know if people, I actually hate share screen, so I don't know what people are planning. I'm not the co-host here, so I'm going to read what I have here. Hopefully you have access to it. Whoever's in charge of this call can decide what they want to do. I'd rather see your faces than the block text, but I'm not in charge. So I'm going to read, just in the interest of time, I'm going to read in English, and then I will, when it's appropriate, focus in on the Hebrew. So I'm going to just start by reading the English, the first 5 psukim, the first 5 verses of the book of Ruth, and then I'm going to pause and I want to sort of lift up a few things in them so you can follow along with the text that you have. It begins. In the days when the chieftains ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah with his wife and 2 sons went to reside in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech, his wife's name was Naomi, and his 2 sons were named Machlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem in Judah. They came to the country of Moab and remained there. Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah, the other Ruth, and they lived there about 10 years. Then those two, the sons died, Machlon and Chilion. So the woman, Naomi, was left without her two sons and without her husband. It's just every sentence in this is unbelievably rich. As I said in the very beginning, the book of Ruth is a literarily beautiful book. Let me tell you two reasons why, and you can see it from these opening psukim. Number one is that Ruth is probably, I would say, more than any other book in my mind, that I can think of, the most intertextual book, right? It will, as you see, play with, I would say, consciously, other narratives, other laws, other passages in the Torah. So it's an incredibly constructed intertextual work. And to know that is to, the more, as I always like to say, the more Torah you know, the better the Torah is, right? So there's a lot of intertextuality that we'll be able to see some of it. It is also incredibly playful, all right? It plays with motifs that run through the entire book. Book of Ruth really is, in some ways, the best example of a biblical short story. More than any other book. You could say maybe the book of Jonah is like that, but I would say that Jonah is even less tight than the book of Ruth. There's a real tightness to the book of Ruth. It's got a beginning, a middle, and an end, and it flows. And it plays with motifs, and it plays with language, and it has words that it repeats. So number one motif that you can see from the very beginning, and it's a motif that really structures and informs the whole story, is it plays with emptiness and fullness. Right? So just to state the obvious, you have a woman, right, and her family that leave Bethlehem, which is the house of bread, in a time of famine. And the motif of being, sort of empty and full get played with throughout this book. So that's one of the things. Another, it also will have certain words, and we're going to see some of those words, like the word that we're going to see in a few moments, we haven't seen it yet, is the word chesed, kindness. This is a word that appears throughout the book and really does tie the book together. It is also quite playful with language, right? And you can see its playfulness from the very beginning in the names that it gives its characters. And it even, as we're going to see, overtly, sometimes you think if it hits you over the head, it's not sort of as literarily eloquent, but it will make itself known because it's going to play directly with the name given to Naomi, who renames herself Mara. So Naomi means pleasantness, and she's going to, as she experiences the emptiness in her life, sort of rename herself as being bitter. So it's self-consciously playing with the names, but it plays with other names. So we have Naomi's husband, Elimelech, right, which means my God is king. And, this is a story that is going to lead to the birth to the ancestor of King David. So that's intentional. Their children, Machlon and Chilion, I love this. If there's ever anything that says the Torah actually is tongue-in-cheek, is the names of these two children. Whatever you do, never name your children or grandchildren or anyone in your pets or your dogs or anything, right, in your lives, Machlon and Chilion, because Machlon is disease and Chilion is destruction. Actually, it's kind of cute. You could, I could imagine maybe a context for doing that. But clearly, these are kids not long for this world, right? And then we have Orpah and Ruth, right? The two daughters-in-law. Orpah, we all know, and the playfulness of like the stiff neck, or she turns her neck when she leaves Naomi. Orpah gets a really bad rep. I'm going to hopefully change that for some of you. But you could say that the name is sort of indicating how she turns away. The one name that is actually not really clear is Ruth, which may be, I've had several explanations given to me, maybe fertility, maybe moisture, but it's not as overt as the other names. So the playing with the names, right, and playing with themes and motifs and having words that appear throughout the book really show the literary structure and artistry of this particular book. Something else to think about just as you go through this story is characters are paired. And that's also really interesting. So in these opening psukim, in these opening verses, you have pairs given to you. You have Elimelech and Naomi. That's one pair. You have Machlon and Chilion, that's another pair. You have Ruth and Orpah, right? Or you can say Machlon and Ruth, or you can figure out who gets paired with whom. But one of the things that happens in the course of this narrative, right, is how these pairs get reconfigured, right? The pairs break apart and have to be reformed. And obviously, what I'm heading towards is that you ultimately are creating a pairing between Ruth and Naomi, right? But these other pairs have to dissolve first. All right. So, and then just to sort of, because I want to move through the story at the beginning, the catalyst for what's happening, of course, they moved to Moab because of famine and they spend some time there. But then I like to say there's a man drain and all the men die, leaving these women. And so Naomi heads back home in the wake of having lost her children and her husband. So I want to pick up in verse 6 and 7. So Naomi started out with her daughters-in-law in return from the country of Moab. From the country of Moab, she had heard that the Lord had taken note of his people and given them food. Accompanied by her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living, and they set out on the road back to the land of Judah. So you have this mother-in-law and her 2 daughters-in-law returning from leaving Moab and going back into Israel. What is incredibly important for me, just for you to see at this point, is that at this moment, you actually we went from all these different pairings to a trio, right? You have Naomi and her 2 daughters-in-law. And part of what I'm going to say is the trio is not strong, right? It's going to break apart and go into this kind of pairing, into this partnership. But what is absolutely important to know is at this moment in the narrative, Naomi seems equally bound to both daughter-in-laws, and both daughters-in-law seem equally bound to her, right? Things are now about to shift, but I really, this is a genuine question, and you should think about this. Why? They are already, Ruth and Orpah and Naomi are on their way back together. So what happens now such that Naomi is going to decide we should go in a different direction? So that's where I want to pick up. So we're at verses 8, 9, and 10. I'm going to read. So they're coming back on road back to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, turn back each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. And by the way, that's the kindly there is the chesed word that I was talking about. May the Lord grant that each of you find security in the house of a husband. And she kissed them farewell. They broke into weeping and said to her, no, we will return with you to your people. What happened on the road such that Naomi at this point is pushing both of her daughters-in-law away? I don't know, right? But something must have happened, and I want it to be very clear that she pushes both of those daughters-in-law away. Number 2 thing I want us to notice, right? Because again, I want to sort of elevate and give a more positive reading on Orpah. It's clear that at this moment in the narrative, both daughters-in-law want to stay with Naomi. Right? And it's also very clear that it is Naomi, right, that they want to stay with, right? We will return with you to your people, right? So what happens that makes Naomi turn these girls away? I don't know. But what I want to suggest at this moment, when Naomi does confront both of these girls in this moment, and as we're going to see in the next couple of verses that come up, Naomi is redefining her relationship with these girls. She's essentially cutting them off. She is walking away from them. All right, I want you to see that. And to some extent, this shift in her relationship with these daughters-in-laws, I want to say take sort of 2 different stages. She is, in this particular moment, absolving, and this is significant, she is absolving her relationship and her responsibility to both of these girls. And what I want to say in the verses that I just read, what she is saying to them is, you need to go away. I am not your mother. I am not going to behave as your mother. You need to go back to your mother and your mother's house. And in a few moments, you're going to see that she's also absolving her relationship to them as the mother-in-law. She's going to say, I'm also not only am I not your mother, I'm also not your mother-in-law. And she's cutting them off completely. Again, why? I don't know, but she is. Now, I want to say something about how she's sort of saying, I'm not your mother. One of the most remarkable and striking phrases in the verses that I just said is she says to her daughters-in-law, turn back each of you to your mother's house, right? This is for those of you with any familiarity with the Torah, you should have bombs going off, because you have this expression, the house of the mother, the Beit Em. Those of you who've learned with me before, you will understand that that's actually an unbelievably unusual expression. In the biblical world, right, in ancient Israel, the family was an essential component of the society, but the family was called the Beit Av, right? Not the Beit Em. So it was called the house of the father, not the house of the mother. So it is absolutely striking to you, it should be, that she's saying to these girls, you go back to your own mother, you don't stay with me. I am not your mother. Incidentally, just so you know, because it's so great, the expression Beit Em does appear in two other significant places in the Torah, and it matters to think about this. One is it appears in the book of Genesis, actually in Genesis 24, in the story that describes the betrothal of Rivka. Rivka's living in the house of her mother, okay? It also appears twice in the book of Shir Shirim to describe the female lover's home. She's also very connected to her mother. So again, in these very female-centric stories, it is interesting that you have this expression of the house of the mother. But, to sort of figure out, is there something more there? People have suggested that if you put all of these texts together, what does seem to be interesting, and there are other reasons why this may be the case, it suggests, or it has been suggested by scholars, that mothers might have actually taken a very significant role in the betrothals, in the marriages of setting up the marriages of their children. So there's reason to believe that women had a particularly significant role to play, mothers had, in setting up the marriages of their children. So just knowing that, what I want to suggest now is that when Naomi is saying, you go back to your mother, let your mother do what your mother, and she even says that, you find a husband, right? Let your mother find you a husband. I am not going to be your mother. I am not going to help you find yourselves husbands. So she's absolving in this moment her role as the mother. But of course, again, they refuse. They both stay with her. And they say, no, we want to be with you. So then we have stage 2 in the next, how Naomi's relationship is shifting to these girls. So what do we have? Naomi now replies, turn back, right? Go back, my daughters. Why should you go with me? Have I any more sons in my body who might be husbands for you? Turn back, my daughters, for I am too old to be married. And even if I thought there was hope for me, even if I were married tonight and I also bore sons, should you wait for them to grow up? Should you on their account debar yourselves from marriage? Oh no, my daughters, my lot is far more bitter than yours, for the hand of the Lord has struck out against me, right? So she's not hearing this. She's like, no, you guys go back, right? And in this moment, what I want to suggest to you is she has a moment ago said, I'm not your mother. And now she's actually saying, I'm not your mother-in-law, right? Because again, if you think about the structure of Levirate marriage, which is what I'm saying sort of is the structure of what's going on in this story, right? If a man dies without having a child, the brother of that man marries the widow. So what Naomi is actually saying to these girls is I can't provide you with another, I can't have any more sons, right? I can't be your mother-in-law. I can't give you a husband in the form of levirate marriage. I can't provide you with that. So she just a moment ago said, I can't be your mother. And now she's saying, I can't be your mother-in-law. I'm done. I've absolved. There's nothing more that I can do for you. There's nothing more that I can give for you. By the way, just because I can't let it go, it's just me, what I love about this is, first of all, she talks about being too old, which is sort of interesting. It's interesting. And she also says she does not want, she's, what is she really saying? I'm too old. Is she saying I'm too old to be fertile? Maybe. Or is she saying I'm too old and sad? I'm too much in mourning to want to be sexually engaged with someone else? I don't know, right? I actually don't know. One of the things that's interesting about Naomi is how much she's cast as a mourner, how one could actually say that she is in deep mourning, right? And that she is actually, one could say she's even, we'll see in a moment, depressed. So that's interesting. And she's also saying to her daughters-in-law, even if I could have a child, which suggests that maybe she is still fertile, she's just too depressed. She says, even if I could have a child, I don't want you to deny your own pleasures. I don't want you to have to sit around and wait, right? To me, that's a beautiful little glimpse into, if we can say, maybe the sexual lives of women in the ancient world. It's really quite remarkable. But she's saying, no, I'm not going to do it. You guys go back to the house of your mother. And then she says, the last thing she says, which is really quite interesting. She says, my lot is far more bitter than yours, for the hand of the Lord has struck out against me. So she feels like God has assaulted her, right? That's how she understands what's going on. The hand of God has struck against me. She also uses this language, which is just really quite interesting. She says, Ki marli ma'od mikem, because I am, in the way the translation that we have here is, my lot is far more bitter than yours. You may be upset because you lost your husbands, but I lost my husband and my sons. My lot is far worse than you. I am truly mar. I am truly bitter. On the other hand, she could also, another way of reading this, just in the Hebrew, she could be saying, Ki marli mi od mikem, could also be understood as saying, because I am bitter on your account, right? That your presence, who you are in my life, is making me even sadder, even more bitter, and I'm going to push you away. I'm going to push you away. And I realize that I want to keep going because I want you to see a couple more things. So what happens next? Verse 14, they break into weeping, and Orpah kisses her mother-in-law, but Ruth clings to her. That's the most, it's an incredibly, another word that gets played with is this root davak, which is to cling. So Ruth clings to her. So Naomi says to her, see, your sister-in-law has returned to her people and her gods. You go after your sister-in-law, right? So Orpah reluctantly goes back home, and Ruth dafka ba, Ruth clings to Naomi, right? And it's in this moment that I would say the relationship between Ruth and Naomi shifts again, right? The clinging to. So we know dafka, the davak, to cling, is actually a very significant verb in the context of the Torah. It appears most frequently in the context of describing Israel's relationship to God. Right? Israel clings with the same verb, right? The way that Ruth clings to Naomi is the same way that Israel clings to God, right? So there's a moment where I would say, already you can see a kind of parallel is being formed between the character of Ruth and the people of Israel. So she clings to her. And still, right, Naomi pushes her aside and Ruth refuses. And of course, these are the famous lines which we have to read. Ruth replies, don't urge me to leave you, to turn back and not follow you. For wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. Thus and more may the Lord do to me, if anything but death parts me from you. Now, much has been made of these passages and trying to understand what's going on here, right? And this is the moment that often is seen as the paradigm for conversion, right? I don't actually want to go there because in the context of the Bible doesn't really have a sense of conversion in the way that we understand. What is important to me about this passage is that Ruth is pledging herself to Naomi, right? She's clinging to Naomi in the way that Israel is clinging to God. And it is clear that Naomi is the focus of Ruth's ardor, right? If you want to put it in that way, right? Wherever Naomi goes, that's where she's going to go. And of course, the people and Naomi's gods will follow, but it's Naomi that is the focus for Ruth, right? It's Naomi that is the focus. And in fact, if the language of this particular passage, there are parallels in the Tanakh. It's the language actually that we have often in the context of treaties. It's like political language. When a nation pledges loyalty to another nation, we have language that resembles this. So this is a pledge of loyalty. This is Ruth's pledge of loyalty to Naomi, okay? But here's the thing that's really interesting is even though Ruth has shifted her relationship to Naomi, Naomi has not accepted Ruth. And that's very clear in what we have next, because it says, and this is just to read to the end of the chapter, when Naomi saw how determined she was to go with her, she ceased to argue with her, and the two went on until they reached Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole city buzzed with excitement over them. And the women said, "Can this be Naomi?" And Naomi responds, "Don't call me Naomi, call me Mara, for Shaddai has made my lot very bitter. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. How can you call me Naomi when the Lord has dealt harshly with me, when Shaddai has brought misfortune upon me?" So just, very clear that Naomi feels, as I said a moment ago, that she's attacked by God, that the events in her life, that God has caused this bitterness. She's under attack, and that's very important. But to me, and this is the most painful part of the entire book, is here she's coming back with her daughter-in-law who has pledged her loyalty, who is clinging to her. And what does she feel? She feels empty. She feels utterly empty, despite Ruth's presence. So in this moment, I would say she does not accept the relationship, that Ruth has redefined her relationship to Naomi, but Naomi has not redefined her relationship to Ruth. The redefinition for Naomi actually happens in the next chapter, and it's incredible, right? You can see, as I said in the beginning, you have to think about how the relationship evolves between Ruth and Naomi. It evolves, and there is a shift that happens in the second chapter where Naomi begins to accept Ruth. And we're going to look at that. I want to say the two things, like just as I don't really know why Naomi sort of changes her mind on Ruth and sends the girls back home. Was there like a precipitating thing? Like what made her change her mind? Here I would actually say, to me, it's very clear why Naomi begins to accept Ruth. Two things happen. Ruth feeds Naomi, physically feeds her, and one could say emotionally feeds her. So that action, I think, shifts the relationship between the two women. And the second thing that happens is that Naomi begins to see that God is somehow directing events, and that God is actually sort of bringing Ruth to her, right? Which we're going to see in a moment. But so I want to look at the passage where you see that happen. But so we know that Ruth, does return back with Naomi back into Israel and needs to get some food for the family. And so she happens upon, which she doesn't realize is her kinsman's land of Boaz. and she begins to glean in the field, and she interacts with him, and he's very gracious to her, and he invites her to stay and glean in the field. And so you can see this, and I want to pick up in just verse 17 in chapter 2. So she gleans in the field until evening in Boaz's field. Then she beats out what she has gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley, and carries it back with her to town. When her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned, and when she also took out and gave her what she had left over after eating her fill, her mother-in-law asked her, "Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be he who took such generous notice of you." So Ruth told her mother-in-law, whom she had worked with, saying, "The name of the man with whom I work today is Boaz." Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "Blessed be he of the Lord, who is not failed in his kindness to the living or to the dead." So I just want to just stop there for a moment. So this is, to me, the moment where Naomi changes and embraces Ruth, right? It's in this moment. And the two things that happen is that this empty woman gets filled with food. Right? She begins to fill up, that Ruth's care is actually nourishing her physically and emotionally. So that's number one. But number two is she recognizes that even though the text actually says that Ruth happened upon the field of Boaz, and it says it like as if by chance, Naomi doesn't realize it, doesn't see it that way. Right? And you can see I actually did not notice this until preparing for you guys, but you can see it in the details of the text, because when she first says, "Where did you get this food?" she says, "Blessed is he who took such generous notice. Isn't he a good guy? He should be blessed." But the minute that Ruth informs her that it was Boaz, and she recognizes that Boaz is a kinsman of hers, then what does she say? She says, "Blessed be he of the Lord, of God, who has not failed in his kindness for the living or for the dead," right? So she's able to see in the fact that this chance encounter turns out to be the kinsman, means that in fact, God is directing events. And it's being fed by her daughter-in-law and recognizing God's hand that I would suggest transforms Naomi. And now she is ready to fully accept Ruth. And you see there's some really, of all the chapters, there are 4 chapters, as I said. Chapter 3 of Ruth is probably my most favorite chapter, but it's also really kind of complicated. We're not going to do it. I just want to look at the end of the story, because you really see in the course of this book, as I said, not just an acceptance, but a kind of fusion, right? A clinging, right? An identification that happens between Ruth and Naomi. And you really see that identification in the final passages of the book, which are often misunderstood, right? Because some people will look at the ending of this story as that somehow Ruth is erased and Naomi takes her place. But that's not how I see it. I see this as a moment of true fusion and embrace, where Naomi fully accepts Ruth as within her family. So if you go, this is the end of chapter 4. Boaz has agreed to marry Ruth and to redeem the land, which is all great. And the townspeople are witnesses to this. And I want to pick up at verse 11 in chapter 4. It says, "All the people at the gate and the elders answered, 'We are, may the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, both of whom built up the house of Israel. Prosper in Ephrat and perpetuate your name in Bethlehem. And may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, through the offspring which the Lord will give you by this young woman.'" So, as I said, one of the things that's so great about this book is how intertextual it is. It is very rare when you have a biblical book that makes clear mention of other characters in the Tanakh. It doesn't happen all the time. So here you have Rachel, Leah, and Tamar, 3 other women that you actually meet in the book of Breshit. So any reader of this would have to say, well, why bring in these women? And we can all think about it. we don't have the time for that because I do want to leave some time, but I just want you to say that, first of all, this is the town's blessing Naomi on the fact that Ruth is coming into the family and comparing Ruth actually and her house to the house of Rachel and Leah, who are the women who built up the house of Israel. Why these specific women, why Rachel, why Leah, why Tamar, and say like not Rivka and not Sarah? Those are really interesting questions. But to me, what's really interesting is you're taking this Moabite woman and you're putting her into the lineage of Israel. I've been learning this. I had an independent study with a rabbinical student this past semester, and we were talking about the mention of the imahot in liturgy, the mention of the mothers. And, to me, obviously you shouldn't, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah, there's reason to mention them in relationship to the avot that we mentioned in Tefillah. But what's so incredible is here we have 3 women mentioned, and it's almost like it almost makes more sense, instead of saying Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah, to actually say Rachel, Leah, and Tamar, which here you have in the book of Ruth, these 3 women that are kind of presented as the matriarchs of Israel, of which Ruth then becomes part of that lineage. It's really quite amazing. And then we go on to say in verse 13, so Boaz marries Ruth, and she became his wife, and he cohabitated with her. The Lord let her conceive, and she bore a son. So God, one could say, if there's any place that God enters into the narrative as a character, as an actor, it's probably here. So the Lord let her conceive. And the women said to Naomi, blessed be the Lord who has not withheld a redeemer from you today. May his name be perpetuated in Israel. He will renew your life, sustain your old age, for he is born of your daughter-in-law who loves you and is better to you than 7 sons. That is an amazing comment, right? This Moabite woman who had no relationship to you is actually better than 7 sons, right? It inverts all the expectations of what a patriarchal culture should say. So Ruth is more valuable to you than 7 sons. Naomi then takes the child, holds it to her chest, and she becomes its foster mother. And the women neighbors gave him a name, saying, a son is born to Naomi, and they named him Oved, and he was the father of Jesse, who is the father of David. So this is the last thing I'm going to say, and then we can, if there's time, I know I've sort of probably run over. This is the moment in the text where people will say that, in fact, one could argue that Ruth gets erased out of the narrative and Naomi gets sort of replaced, right? The fact that, and people often say that Naomi, the sense of that she takes this child and she becomes its omenet, and people even suggest that she nurses the child and effectively becomes its surrogate mother. I want to just say, it's not how I read this at all. And we know this from other texts and we even have some examples of this even in the biblical text, that there's a gesture of adoption is when you take the children and you put it on your lap, you gather the children to you. That seems to be a formal gesture of adoption. And we see that elsewhere, and I think we see that going on here. I do not think that Naomi is nursing this child. I think she is accepting this child and its mother as fully part of her family. And the use of omenet, which is often translated as nursemaid, right? And she nurses the child, actually doesn't really mean that at all. It means she cares for the child. By the way, Mordechai, actually, just to prove this to you, Mordechai is an omen, right? And one could say also adopts Esther. So that's an interesting, use of the word, but probably the most familiar use of this word actually is in Numbers, I believe in chapter 11, where Moses is sort of angry at God and basically says, I'm not the nursemaid of this kid. I'm not the omen of Israel. You are God. So the use of this word here is not indicating that she's nursing this child or that she is sort of usurping Ruth's position. Rather, I think that what you have in this particular moment is an absolute embrace of Ruth into her family and her children as being part of the lineage, not just of, and now I'm just in the moment, so take it for what it is. To me, what's great about the ending is that you have the ancient lineage, you have Rachel, Leah, and Tamar, of which Ruth becomes a part of the ancient lineage. She then becomes a part of Naomi's actual family, but then it is from this union, right, that you are then going to have the lineage of David and all of his sons. So you have the past, the present, and the future of Israel really all rolled into the relationship between Naomi and Ruth. All right. That's what I've got. I don't know how, I probably have gone a little over time. I'm happy to, I don't know, Tani, how you want to do this. I don't know if someone else is going to speak, but I'm happy to, if we have time, ask some questions or however anyone wants to handle it.
Thank you, Professor Kalmanofsky. That was really, really excellent. And we do have until 3:30, so we do have plenty of time for questions. And also, if there's any other material that you wanted to introduce, we have some time for that as well. One question we had was just about who authored the Book of Ruth and when the book was written. Is there some contradictions as to when the book might have been written?
Oh, well, authorship questions are always fun to answer. Because I always like to say I like studying the Bible because there are no no one knows, right? We have no actually idea of who authored the Book of Ruth. I think behind that question, the simple question of like the dating of the book, it's usually considered to be among the later books that we have in the Tanakh, partly because, as I said, it's so intertextual. Right. So the fact that it makes so many references to other texts, I think also gives you an indicator of its dating. So that's like, it's usually seen as being kind of late in the context of the Tanakh at large. But I think behind that question, which, I hear, but maybe is not really behind the question, is whether or not the Book of Ruth is actually authored by a woman. Which is always an interesting question. We do know that women, wrote, and certainly, other kinds of ancient texts outside of the Hebrew Bible. They were, in other cultures, they sort of functioned scribally, and we do know that they were part of that. We don't have any evidence of that in the Tanakh itself. But it often comes up because it is such a female-centric book, and that in some ways, maybe this is one of it. And by the way, it also comes up around with Shir Shirim as well, and even with Esther, that these books that feature women, that maybe in fact, they were, composed by women. But as I always like to say in that moment, Madame Bovary is not written by a female. Like, just because something focuses on a woman doesn't necessarily mean that a woman wrote the book. So, I mean, if that was behind that question, we don't know, but it's certainly nice to think that it may be written by a female.
Thank you. Just getting a bunch of questions. And one question we had earlier was just if you could expand on the parallel to the story of Tamar and Yehuda, that there are several parallels here, and it was just interesting to explore.
So I will. I mean, I actually kind of skipped over, so this is also a good place to fill in. Obviously, the mention of Tamar at the end of this book is interesting, right? So the story of Judah and Tamar, which we have in the book of Genesis, is also another ideological story about the birth of King David, because it is, it is sort of the union of Judah and Tamar, and it's also kind of a Levirate marriage narrative as well. But Tamar sleeps with her father-in-law, Judah, and their child then, of course, leads to ultimately the ancestry, which will also end up in the birth of King David. So it's actually really quite interesting. So you have, we don't actually have, in the context of the Torah itself and the story of any of the books of Samuel and Kings, any story of the birth of David himself. We don't get that story. We meet David at a later date in his life. He's a relatively young man, but we don't actually have his birth story. So the closest thing that we come to a birth story for King David is the story of Judah and Tamar, and also the book of Ruth. So this is really quite interesting, right? Because there are real parallels in these two stories. They both are stories that are defined by Levirate marriage, which is itself really quite interesting. And they are also, Tamar's lineage is a little less clear than Ruth is, but Tamar seems to be Canaanite. So we have this kind of sense of King David's story beginning in, with these two sort of foreign women that through Levirate marriage get absorbed into being Israelite. And it raises really interesting questions. And, for those people, and, sort of similar to the question of, who wrote the book of Ruth, if you really want, people with a real need to anchor these narratives in history will often say, well, that must mean that David really came out of some kind of, really was the product of a foreign mother of some sort, that there's some kind of historical kernel of truth in this narrative, right? I always like to say in the Torah, I'd rather assume things are not historically accurate, because when they're not historically accurate, they're much more interesting. So I find it, much more interesting to think about why would this great figure in Israel's history have these two origin stories of coming from these Levirate marriages with these foreign women. I mean, that to me is just a really profound question to ask. And I think it's very related to, the topic for this whole series, because I think there is something about the Bible's sort of, in some ways, it privileges the bloodline of David. Absolutely, right? The dynasty of David is a privileged dynasty. It's a stable dynasty, father to son. It's incredibly significant. We're still waiting for the ancestor of David to come back again. And yet the Torah counterbalances that bloodline with these stories of others that get absorbed into Israel that are not part of the bloodline. And there's something, I actually find that incredibly profound and intentional, right? Lest you think, this is to some extent why I feel like this book matters so much today, lest you think that we are a community that is completely defined by blood and biology. We're not, right? We're really not. And these stories, Ruth's story really brings that to the fore. It's a decision on Ruth's part to be loyal to and cling to Naomi. She had no relationship to her, right? It was that loyalty that then led to the line of David. And so for me, it's a real corrective to David's sort of lineage and the fact that biology certainly becomes so significant for the Israel community, but it's not the whole story.
Thank you. I have several more questions. I'm going to try to get through some of them. So going back to, I guess, what you said in the beginning of the session about how the prohibition against marrying Moabite women, that it was interesting that it didn't say any, the children, Elimelech and Naomi, the children, went ahead and married Moabite women. It didn't say anything about the prohibition, and kind of, what does this say about the Israelis' relationship with other nations living in the area, like during that time?
Well, I think it's all somewhat connected. Many people think, on the face value of the narrative, there's no judgment, right? There's famine, they go to Moab, they marry Moabite women. And yet rabbinically, right, I think they feel like, and one could say Naomi also feels like somehow what happens to them when they end up in Moab is a punishment for having left Israel and in fact defied the prohibition. But I want to be clear that this is a story that absolutely does not say that. It does not make that explicit. And again, it goes out of its way to absorb this Moabite woman. So I actually would say that it seems to me that this is a story that is 100% aware of the prohibition and is 100% intentional in some ways defying or countering that prohibition, right? I mean, it seems to be intentionally doing that.
Thank you. Another interesting question, just kind of about the contrast between, how we talked about the lineage, and the women's role in the lineage of David, and then kind of the contrast between that and then the line being so male-centric coming from, from David. So kind of just, can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I mean, obviously, to some extent, it's also about patrilineal or matrilineal descent to some extent, right? And, who matters more? And I think actually, obviously, in some ways, in the biblical world, patrilineal descent did, in fact, matter more. And as we know in Israel, in Jewish history, at some point that shifts, right? In the early Middle Ages. I mean, I'm not a historian of this, so somebody else can answer this, but it shifts and matrilineal descent becomes really significant. And again, to me, in the context of the Torah, there's great intentionality in this, where I do feel that there is an absolute intention on the part of the Torah to elevate the female line and to make these women incredibly central to this narrative and determining forces, right? Determinative forces. So I feel like it is, I don't have the answer why. I think it is absolutely unusual and interesting and significant and, has to be reckoned with in the context of the story.
Thank you. Just kind of trying to keep up with the questions that are coming in. And I would have to go back to the text myself just to just kind of clarify, but I did get one question kind of asking how specifically when Ruth marries Boaz, she's not referred to as Ruth the Moabite. So kind of, can you comment?
So another one, I can. I mean, again, the literary mastery of this book is amazing. And so one of the things you should play with as you go back through the story is how characters are referred to. So it's also like how Ruth is referred to, whether she's referred to as the Moabite, whether she is referred to as the woman who returns or the woman who comes in. These are sort of, I think, significant markers in the story that in some ways indicate her absorption into the family. So I think that actually when she's no longer referred to as the Moabite is actually significant, right? That she's sort of accepted into the narrative and accepted into the family.
Thank you. I had another question about how the word redeemer is used throughout the story, especially at the end. Is Obed the redeemer of Naomi, or is it Ruth? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so it's sort of the goel in the narrative is really I think at the end of the story, to some extent, there's no separation really between Ruth and Naomi. And so in some ways, this is the goel, the person who marries Ruth, right? And also is able to redeem the land and the property of the family. So that, again, it's sort of like the function, not just of the individual that sort of has the child with Ruth, but also is the individual who redeems the land and the property for Naomi and the family, of which Ruth also benefits. So I think it's a kind of inclusive term. Yeah. But I mean, we don't have to, I mean, I'm happy to sort of offline at some point if people still have questions to answer, and we can, you know, if there are other questions that you feel like are burning, otherwise we can, I'm happy to take them later personally.
Okay, there was one other question I thought might be interesting to present to the group. Just you had mentioned, you know, we talked about how you know, the absence of God in the story, and just kind of contrasting that to, you know, Naomi does, you know, seem to have a relationship with God throughout. You know, she calls on God and you know, brings up, you know, God,
Yeah.
you know, during the book. So can you speak to that a little bit?
So I actually always say like that. So again, just to go to the beginning, the 3 books of which, you know, God is really not an actor, right? Shira Shirim, Esther, and Ruth, right? God is not a, you know, a formal actor in the narrative, directing things and engaging directly with characters and all of that. But the acknowledgement of God's presence is probably strongest in the book of Ruth. And as I said, I think my reading of the shift in Naomi's character is her understanding that God is in fact directing the events and in fact bringing Ruth into her life. And I think, you know, it's God, you know, it's awareness of the divine that I think saturates the book of Ruth. And there's also the language of blessing is very much part of the book of Ruth. But in contrast, you know, Shira Shirim, there's only one place potentially where you actually may have an allusion to God or, you know, some reference, but pretty much unlikely. And of course, famously, Esther doesn't mention God at all, though it also may be alluded to at one particular moment. But I would say Ruth is different in that way, that that the characters are aware of God's presence, but God is not directly engaged with the characters. So I think that makes it different.
Okay, Dr. Kalmanofsky, I just wanted to thank you so much. You know, as you mentioned, I'll be happy to share if I have other, you know, burning questions in the chat. I'll be happy to share them with you afterwards. Really, thank you so much for that, for the fascinating take on the Book of Ruth, and for really making it come to life for us, and this excellent preparation for Shavuot coming up in just 2 weeks. So I want to thank you so much. And I just wanted to mention we have one more session next week in our series of the Other in Jewish Text and Tradition. Rabbi Danny Nevins will be teaching. The session will be entitled "From the Outside In: How a History of Marginalization Affects Jewish Responses to Marginal Populations Today." We'll be taking a look at classical Jewish texts to consider their implications for the role of Judaism in addressing marginalization in contemporary contexts, and really felt like this was an excellent way to close out our series. Thank you so much, and we look forward to, we hope you'll be able to join us next week.